We have 12:30, and I welcome everybody to this year's annual international forum. I would have hoped to see you all in person in Cologne. That's much preferable to online formats, but that's the way it is these times. Somebody is working on the walls somewhere. So I'm looking forward to this first workshop, our annual forum. And I will introduce our panelists one by one before their presentations. But I can say beforehand that not only they're very renowned experts, but also that we have a very multilingual panel. Each of them has at least 3, some even 6 languages to work in. So I'm really impressed, and I think that's a very nice start for an international forum. Our first presenter, and you already have the title of his presentation on your screen, I hope, is Johannes De Haan. And he works as a crime prevention and criminal justice officer at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC. And he's responsible for developing crime prevention programs. He provides advisory and technical support for the development of crime prevention initiatives and is busy in mainstreaming crime prevention in the work of UNODC. Mr. De Haan has developed a particular focus on community-based and urban crime prevention, as well as on the prevention of delinquency amongst youth. Currently, he is leading the implementation of the youth crime prevention component of the UNODC Global Program to support the implementation of the 215 Doha Declaration. Before joining the UN, Mr. De Haan worked for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, both at the headquarters in Vienna and in the mission in Kosovo, as well as for the European Rule of Law mission for Iraq and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the Netherlands. He has a master's degree in international humanitarian assistance and has a teaching degree from Groningen University. So, Joe, I'm looking forward to your presentation, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Burkhard. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I hear some noises here and there. Maybe Burkhard, if you don't mind muting yours, maybe that helps a little bit. I hope everybody can hear me. Thanks for the introduction, Burkhard. It's really good to be here again at the German Prevention Congress, Crime Prevention Congress, where, as UNODC, we're always very eager to interact with both the German crime prevention experts as well as the international experts that are gathering. Like you said, Burkhard, it's a pity that we cannot all meet in person. Online is always a bit different, and especially as the first speaker in these online events, you always have the least number of participants because people tend to join a little bit later, so that's good for the speakers after me. But I'm happy to start and say a few words here about the 14th United Nations Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice that took place only last month. As I guess I also speak on behalf of the other panelists, thought it would be a good moment to look back a little bit at this Congress and what has happened there, what are the main takeaways for prevention, with a view to have a bit of a discussion around this, see what this means for prevention action globally, maybe also Germany or Europe-wide, and to see where action is needed and what various actors are doing to support implementing the commitments made. So as you know, the United Nations Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice takes place every 5 years. The last one was in Doha. Before this one, the 13th Congress was in Doha, Qatar. The 14th Congress in March this year took place in Kyoto, Japan. It was, of course, during the pandemic, which meant that it was a hybrid Congress, very similar to the German Crime Prevention Congress. We had a lot of people attending online and a small group of people that were in Kyoto itself. We had over 5,000 people that took part in total. A record of 152 member states were represented at the Congress, along with around 115 non-governmental organizations and more than 600 individual experts. So in that sense, it was a very well attended Congress, and over 6 days, the participants there discussed the challenges facing the world and how to tackle them to advance crime prevention and criminal justice, to promote the rule of law and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We think those goals have become even more important now as the fabric in many societies is wearing with the COVID pandemic and disproportionately affecting, of course, the most vulnerable. So the whole, of course, COVID situation, limitations and challenges featured throughout the discussions. What I want to say a little bit on today is around the discussion on crime prevention. We saw in the plenary discussions there was agenda item 3 that zoomed in on prevention and socioeconomic development, and this was then followed by more in-depth exchanges among practitioners in workshops, the one on evidence-based prevention and statistics, as well as workshop on education, youth, and resilience. So here on this slide, I highlighted those items of the official agenda of the Congress that featured most prominently prevention. Others, of course, also had some prevention elements, but the agenda item 3 and workshop 1 and 3 were the main prevention focused items on the agenda of this year's Congress. So as outlined, of course, in the reports that we as United Nations Secretariat for the Congress prepared in advance of the Congress, it was very clear that the relationship between crime and economic and social development, the topic of agenda item 3, that presents several dimensions. On the one hand, we see, of course, crime as an impediment to economic growth and development. It leads to an increase of economic uncertainty, discourages long-term investments, employment opportunities, and can also erode the rule of law. On the other hand, we also see that the lack of economic growth in connection to high economic and social inequality tends to increase levels of crime and violence and fuels this. So against this background, member states reflected on crime prevention throughout the Congress discussions, and I would like to highlight some of the observations that were made and that might be of interest to spark some discussions here as well. The first point is, of course, goes without saying that organized crime, corruption, urban crime, the latter very much refer to a lot to gang violence, etc. But they all have a very major impact on economic development. But an important point, I think, is that effective crime prevention, and this was again stressed by member states and experts in the Congress, is really key for sustainable development. And especially when we're looking at the targets under Sustainable Development Goal 16 that relates to the rule of law, crime, violence reduction, it's good to see that member states acknowledge the importance of prevention, and they also have have highlighted that in their contributions, their voluntary reporting on the progress made towards the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030. States voluntarily report on their progress, as I mentioned, and several countries in that context also refer to the prevention policy, strategies, and programs that they have put in place. In this context, it's also encouraging to see that that member states highlight over and over again that prevention efforts really should be inclusive and integrated, and they should go beyond the criminal justice system. Of course, we see in many countries also where we work that the first actor that is being asked to look into prevention is the police, law enforcement. But of course, it goes without saying that the various sectors of the criminal justice system, as well as ministries of health, development, education, housing, have an important role to play. And this was again stressed in the Congress as well. And besides the public sector and the various ministries and civil society, also the private sector was stressed as an important contributor to prevention action. Second point I would like to say a bit about relates to the fact that the strained socioeconomic conditions due to the COVID-19 pandemic really impacted heavily on crime, and not just crime and violence, but also efforts to prevent and respond to it. We see that there were many challenges in providing and accessing services which are key, public services which are key to prevention, and the COVID-19 pandemic with their lockdowns and other related measures, of course, had an impact on that. In terms of crime, I think it was very clear also from the Congress discussions that the lockdowns and really, changed crime rates, but differently across categories, places, and times. So we see, for example, on the one hand, homicide rates went down during lockdowns across Europe, for example, but the trend was not that uniform in Latin America. We also see a lot that property crimes went down, but on the other hand, cybercrime, online fraud increased in many countries. As I said, in terms of prevention, we see that the pandemic really made implementation of community-based crime and violence prevention initiatives more difficult. We also saw, when we're looking, for example, at the problem-oriented, community-oriented types of policing, we saw that the priorities of police had to shift often from proactive community engagement programs to more securing compliance with COVID-19 measures. So there was a lot of discussions around COVID and the impact of crime, as well as on crime prevention. Interestingly enough, also the Congress again emphasized the need to address socioeconomic exclusion and inequalities. Of course, with COVID, that became even more prominent. In this context, several states refer to the programs they have in place on education, skills training, positive youth development, through sometimes very innovative activities, including those related to recreation and sports. There was also a resolution recently adopted by the General Assembly about the integration of sport into youth crime prevention and criminal justice strategies, and this was something that was highlighted by several member states as an avenue that they are exploring at the moment. In this regard, it was also important the early intervention programs for groups at risks of crime and victimization, as was the importance of facilitating socialization and reintegration of those in conflict with the law, and the importance of restorative justice came up in that context. So here we're talking really about tertiary crime prevention. The need to involve local communities was mentioned a lot, and of course, you know, in the subsequent workshops and other side events, there was a lot of, you know, very practical ways to go about that, which was I think very encouraging to see and very helpful for different countries and experts to learn from. In this context, also community-oriented policing was frequently mentioned. And last but not least, very much of a red thread throughout the discussions was really the need to put more attention on measuring impact of crime prevention programs. Knowledge-based, evidence-based prevention is often flagged, but we see that there's attention to being given to this and resources being dedicated to evaluating and measuring impact of prevention, but it's not the case everywhere, especially in low resource settings and in the global south. Often the resources are not there, or they are not there for, you know, sufficient amount of time in order to generate the evidence that is needed to really find out what works and what doesn't work. The Congress has adopted a declaration called the Kyoto Declaration, and this is, let's say, a bit of, you know, our an action-oriented document that will be endorsed at the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice next week in Vienna. And this declaration, this contains a substantive set of actions that states have agreed to follow up on, and that we hope will push forward the prevention agenda globally. I put here on the slide the actions that really, you know, are listed under the heading of crime prevention. So the development and implementation, evaluation of strategies that really address root causes, which is good to have that spelled out so clearly in order to, you know, really balance the more responses to crime with more preventative action. The importance of evidence-based prevention and the data, the need for more collection analysis of data and use of coherent criteria was flagged. And in connection to that, of course, the improvement of quality and available data on crime and crime trends. If I can add to that also the root causes of crime and violence. And of course, here also as UNODC, we really try to support states in improving that. The promoting prevention at the local level was stressed in the declaration. And there the cooperation between public and the police was highlighted. Positive conflict resolution, community-oriented policing. Better prevention of violence against women and gender-related killings is featuring under the prevention chapter, so to speak. The protection of rights and the needs to address the needs of children and youth and to protect them from abuse, both offline and online, was highlighted. Including their involvement in gangs and involvement by violent extremist groups. And finally, the need to empower youth was highlighted. I mean, we have in the United Nations the 2030 Youth Strategy that really highlights the need for youth empowerment. And also in the context of crime prevention, this came back into the declaration, the needs for them to become active agents of change in community-based prevention. Looking both at education as well as cultural, recreational activities, also the use of social media. As UNODC, of course, we will support and continue to support member states to implement their commitments in the field of crime prevention. And I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of what we are doing and the areas that we are working on. As you see, it very much fits with the declaration and the action agreed in the declaration. So on the one hand, we, as UNODC, including our research branch and our substantive sections, are really supporting states to do more on data collection analysis, to really provide the basis for knowledge and evidence-based policies, strategies, and programs. So on the one hand, we support safety audits, victimization surveys, we help to improve national and global crime statistics, SDG monitoring. But also we support the development of policies and strategies and advice. So informed by the data, informed by the surveys, to help really setting these strategic frameworks, both at national and also at local levels. Local levels, for example, you can think of local safety strategies or crime prevention strategies that cities develop, either for a given, citywide or certain neighborhoods. We also then support training and capacity building for crime prevention and criminal justice practitioners. There, I think it's important to mention, of course, that we look at what the criminal justice system can do, what can be done on community-oriented policing, problem-oriented policing, alternatives to imprisonments, victim support, restorative justice, etc. But we're also looking at what other actors can do into the education system, health, or prison services, of course, for reintegrating offenders. And finally, partnerships is, of course, key. As UNODC, we have a clear crime drug mandate, but we acknowledge, of course, that crime prevention is a very broad concept. So also in terms of working together with other UN actors, this is key for making impact on the ground. But similarly, we try to really encourage partnerships with countries, with different institutions in countries, international, regional organizations, as well as South-South cooperation, to really share those knowledges on what works and what doesn't work, what are lessons learned among countries, which we think is very important for advancing the crime prevention agenda. So with that, I hope I set a bit the scene of what was discussed in Kyoto at the Crime Congress. What are we doing as UNODC? And I would like them to give back the floor to the moderator for the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joop, for this insight into the Congress proceedings. Before I open the floor, and I have to make a remark on that too, can you tell us where and when we would find further documentation of the proceedings of the Congress and the workshops and the other events?
Yes, for sure. Of course, the Congress, all the pre-Congress documentation has been online already for some time. Also, most of the reports of the various items were there now. And today, the overall report of the entire Congress, including the declaration, was posted on the website. And I think I can put that here in the chat, so that everybody can access the report itself. So that's basically captures everything that was discussed and references to all the documentation.
Thank you very much, Joop. Chat is one point I forgot to mention. For our audience, any questions you want to raise, please put into the public chat that is in your upper left corner of the screen, the chat function, because we cannot open the microphones for everybody. So if I see one question, but note that is Joop's link. But any other questions that you would have for the panelists, please enter into the public chat. We have now the second presentation by Professor Douglas Durán from Costa Rica, from the Institute for Latin America of the United Nations on Crime Prevention and Delinquency. And he will give us a presentation on the non-governmental the major non-governmental parts of the Congress, where, from the scientists' point of view, the music is playing. And by way of introduction, I would like to say that Professor Douglas Durán is the director of the Institute ILANUD, and he studied law at the University of Costa Rica. and also studied criminology at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. And he also has been a researcher at the Department of Criminology of the Max Planck Institute in Germany, in Freiburg. He's a member of the International Society for Criminology's Scientific Commission, and he has lectured in many universities in the Americas, in Europe, and in Africa. And his fields of work are criminology, penitentiary system, criminal policy, juvenile justice, restorative justice, and prevention. Douglas, you have the floor. So. There you go.
Well, hello. Thank you for the invitation. And at the same time, I would like to send a warm greeting to panelists. It is an honor for the United Nations Latin American Institute for the Prevention of Crime and the Treatment of Offenders, ILANUD, to participate in this Congress. Thanks also to those who follow us through the platform enabled for this Prevention Day. At United Nations Congresses on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, some issues are always highlighted, placing them in the so-called high-level segment. Placing them in that segment, they are given special attention, and one of those issues this time was precisely that of statistics, to which a workshop was dedicated, where specialists from different regions of the world took part to give a comparative perspective, which is always, as we all know, of great relevance. Thus, we had experts from UNODC Vienna, the UNODC Center of Excellence of Mexico, and the Department of Justice of the state of Victoria, Australia, in this workshop. The first thing that seems important to highlight is that statistics on crime and criminal justice is an issue that has always been central in the actions taken by the United Nations. In recent times, the trend is reflected, for example, in the emphasis that this topic was given at the United Nations Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice that was held in Doha, Qatar in 2015. Later on, due to its relevance, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is also, although in a general way, a benchmark, since it establishes data generation as a fundamental tool for the achievement of the proposed objectives considered key to decision making. As far as all of us are concerned, of course, the importance of statistical information is immense insofar as it allows us to know the dimensions and the characteristics of the phenomenon of crime, as well as its trends. This naturally then allows criminal policy actions to be implemented with greater chances of success. However, it is required data to be collected and systematized in the best possible way, which of course has often great challenges and great difficulties. Work has been done in order to generate guidelines that are useful to develop more reliable systems with regard to the methods of collecting and analyzing information. It is equally clear that the data in our field of work are produced by different institutions that do not necessarily belong to the same sector, since it deals with both law enforcement and criminal justice, as well as entities, for example, from the health sector or in general from the executive branch. One of the challenges then is that the diversity of this quantity of information is to be compatible and comparable at national level, as well as later at international level. In fact, we can have data of very high quality, but if these are not comparable, we lose the opportunity to make more in-depth analysis of the phenomena that are the object of our work, of the policies that we can develop in this regard, or of the projects carried out for crime prevention, which at the same time proposes the issue of monitoring and evaluation as tools for establishing best practices. The standardization of indicators is vital in achieving these objectives and facilitates the comparability of results at the local, national, and international levels, which is fundamental to the prevention work that interests us. On the other hand, the progress we make in terms of comparability should be complemented by the improvement that is promoted in what corresponds to issues as disaggregation, which today, from the perspective of the United Nations, improves the possibilities of access to justice, which is one of the sustainable development goals contemplated in the 2030 Agenda, for example, regarding the visibility of the victimization of children, women, the elderly, and in general people in vulnerable situations. In this respect, the United Nations has managed to determine that only around half of the countries in the world report intimate partner violence, and in many cases, when this information exists, it is of a questionable quality. Besides, it's not comparable. In relationship to this issue of sustainable development goals, it was mentioned at the Kyoto Congress that the 2030 Agenda has been a factor that has facilitated the creation of suitable spaces to improve the coordination of initiatives at both national and international level. We know there are specific cases of countries where, from the impulse of the agenda, interinstitutional coordination mechanisms have been put into operation with excellent results. Regarding the harmonization of the information, the international classification of crime for statistical purposes proposed by UNODC provides great advances in terms of the possibility of having comparable data at international level. On this point, an important recommendation is the creation of national entities to centralize the coordination of the different agencies that produce statistical information, which would precisely facilitate that the different branches use uniform collection and systematization criteria. These committees or commissions would not be hierarchical bodies, but rather liaison centers between the different actors involved in this type of process in all sectors. In this respect, it has been noted that in a variety of countries, better coordination has been achieved between agencies based on the impulse that the 2030 Agenda has given to this topic of improving statistics on crime and criminal justice. We have made a quick review regarding the topic of crime and criminal justice statistics in Latin America in the context of national plans and reports on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, and we verified that in the countries and between sub-regions, great interest has arisen in issues related to the improvement of information systems from the perspective of the Sustainable Development Goals. In some countries, specific constructed modules taking into account the targets associated with the Sustainable development objectives have been included in the national censuses, which will provide concrete information of indisputable interest to develop prevention actions. There were 3 other topics that were subjects of interest at the workshop on crime and criminal justice statistics at the Kyoto Congress, namely the so-called data revolution, with all that this implies in terms of the new information that could be used. Secondly, the gap that exists in terms of information, which does not always reach to public opinion, and the challenges that the pandemic has posed in relation to the information gathering processes. First, regarding the abundant sources of information now generated through administrative offices and the private sector, the usefulness of such data was discussed. It is indisputable that there is a whole new and ample possibility to take advantage of. However, the importance of taking into account the risks that could be faced with regard to privacy and in general to the fundamental rights of people was highlighted in the discussions. Indeed, it is necessary that a wide range of safeguards exists and is properly applied at a national level to protect the rights of citizens against the dangers of either of their data being violated or used incorrectly or in an abusive way. It is not only through special laws that this objective can be achieved, but is also necessary to develop specific protocols for handling information. The other topic I mentioned that was discussed in the workshop was the gap that exists between the large amount of data that exists today and the access that people have to it. The question debated has special relevance in the context of the formulation of criminal policy, since we know that this gap frequently leads to perceptions that too often have no scientific foundation and that rather are far away from evidence-based information. On this point, the importance of bringing citizens closer to data and facilitating the possibility to know more about the crime phenomenon and about the operation of criminal justice based on scientific information and not presumptions or inaccurate or incomplete pseudo-knowledge was emphasized. And of course, an extremely trending topic is the challenges that the pandemic has posed in terms of, above all, the collection of statistical information. On this point, it is evident that the work related to household surveys and censuses has been frequently interrupted by the difficulties that lockdowns arouse. They reported, for example, from Australia, that given this scenario, they have decided to perform non-representative studies during these lockdown periods. The situation also forced changes to be made in Mexico, from where they informed us, for example, of a survey that had been planned for a long time to be carried out in the prison systems that had to be suspended due to the closure that we know occurred in most prisons around the world to avoid first the entry of the virus and later a further spread. Ultimately, we discussed that these obstacles due to COVID-19 regarding information collection have forced to carry out a series of changes in addition to the relocation of budgets that were previously for research statistics and are now for emergency actions to face the pandemic, especially, as Johannes mentioned, in low and middle income countries, changes that now need to be evaluated and which make us wonder how much can be learned from these experiences in terms of data collection in order to improve in the field of prevention. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Douglas, for your presentation. It's I'm really happy to hear about the Congress, the success and the the going further on the work on comparable statistics. Sorry, because that's an issue that's been with us, with the UN and with all international criminological institutions for quite a while. I had hoped to ask you more about the issue of using the mining, so to speak, the existing data that is almost a treasure, but hard to get at. But we're running a little bit short of time. So I hope for your understanding if I don't go deeper into that issue, which I've been busy with for about 5 to 10 years during my professional time. So I'm sad, but I'm happy on the other hand to turn to Irvin. Irvin has been repeatedly on the German crime prevention congresses, and I remember very well on one of the congresses where he was wearing his white shirt with the IDGs, SDGs on his back. It's always memorable, your passion for crime prevention and for consulting and advising governments. Irvin was a professor at the University of Ottawa in Canada, and he really has won international recognition for contributing to policy advances in crime prevention and victims' rights, starting with his pioneering of the resolution on victims' rights in 1985. That was a resolution passed first at the Milano Congress in 1985 and then later on by the UN General Assembly. He served on several national commissions in Canada, in England, in South Africa, the US, and has advised governments in about 50 countries, including most of Latin America. And he was a pioneer of the Safer Cities program with UN Habitat, which Juma will tell us later on. His books have been published in at least 5 languages, so there's no excuse for not reading them. And I would like to invite you to go for his vita on his website, urbanwaller.org, because there you really find the most pertinent information on him. It would be too much to go into more detail. Just one thing that I remember about Irvin and the impression that he creates. Some of you will know the old Richard Nixon quote that once you got them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. You, Irvin, transformed that once you got them by the pocketbook, their hearts and minds will follow into crime prevention. So, Irvin, you have the floor.
So, good morning, good afternoon. So, here we go. So, I'm going to talk to accelerator actions needed to achieve significant reductions in violent crime for Agenda 2030. And I'm going to build very much on what Johannes has shared with you about the Kyoto Congress. My bottom lines are basically 3, but the most important is that we cannot go on doing the same and expect different results. And Kyoto, in my view, reinforces small changes when we need much more of the transformations that the Secretary General of the UN has called for on all of the SDGs. So if we're actually going to achieve significant reductions in violent crime for Agenda 2030, particularly in the high violence regions in the Americas or in Africa, we have to do some things differently. And that's going to require intergovernmental organizations, including the UNODC, but also World Health Organization, UN Women, Habitat, and particularly the development banks, so the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. And we're going to need to raise a lot more awareness of the potential of prevention. That's data is not just numbers, it's outcomes. We're going to have to do capacity building that is not just capacity building to teach people life skills. It's capacity building so that people know how to plan in government to achieve goals, and how people working in cities know how to use the science to achieve things. We're going to have to work with the city networks that are in many ways ahead of governments. And yes, we're going to have to foster shifts in national action, particularly in those high violence countries. National governments are going to have to do things very differently. They're going to have to plan as to how they're going to achieve significant reductions, and cities will have to do things differently. So Johannes gave us the key things in the Kyoto Declaration, and in my view, these are wonderful. They're actually not that new, but to see them so clearly stated is certainly good, and certainly a basis for shifting what we're doing. The challenge to us is huge. 500,000 homicides is what the UNODC statistics talks about. 25 million women raped. It's harder to get a reliable figure, but it could be a lot more than that. The WHO tells us nearly 1 billion children who are victims of violence. And there are estimates that this is costing the world in harm to victims, very important to me, $7 trillion. And as Johannes has rightly emphasized, there is a huge loss in GDP, particularly in those high violence countries. And this is not just due to gun violence, it's also due to intimate partner and sexual violence. So the impact on women is often overlooked as its contribution to their world, to future generations, and to the economy of their countries. So to reduce violence significantly by 2030, which is what governments are committed to do, we've got to act differently. So we have to help governments and cities, and by the way, the intergovernmental agencies, including UNODC, to act differently to get different results. And yes, there will be some good news, hopefully, in changes in broad social demographic policies due to other SDGs. But we're going to have to use proven prevention programs that are not really talked about in Kyoto, that target risk factors, that is mentioned, but there are proven programs, and not just from the global north. We are going to need to use the guidelines that have come from other congresses and have been adopted by ECOSOC and by UN Habitat, and indeed by the World Health Organization. And these are really important, and they will not happen on their own. They're going to require capacity building of the people who will implement them. And we also need to work with the cities who are leading, the networks of cities, the cities that have succeeded. And we're going to actually have to put money into accelerators, into helping those city networks, into awareness amongst decision makers and the public, actually often reinforcing what the public already knows, training the implementers, and providing adequate funding for leading edge innovation. So as cities innovate, as countries in the high violence areas move to actions that will reduce violence, they're going to need support. The good news is that we have significant solid science. We have those guidelines. We have successes. We know a lot about how to get buy-in. We don't always know how to keep the buy-in, but we're not using them. So we need to get to know this, and this needs to be very much promoted by those intergovernmental organizations, by the governments who want to contribute to less violence because it's in their personal self-interest or because the affluent world is prepared to provide aid money to do it. So we really need to focus much more on accelerators. So let me deal with each of those 4 issues that I identified a slide earlier. We know from the World Health Organization that there are many things that contribute to different crime rates. I want to just focus on a simple comparison between 4 affluent cities. New York City against London. Huge differences in homicide rates. The one with the high homicide rates, more police officers, and very high levels of incarceration. And by the way, London, England is not happy with 1.6 homicides. London has just re-elected its mayor, who started a violence reduction unit based on Glasgow that I'm going to talk about. And that is being spread across England, and a mayor has got re-elected on a tough on causes, This is very important. So many politicians don't think that they can face down the criminal justice system and the public to do the things that will actually save lives and protect women and children. My other favorite comparison is, of course, because I live in Canada, and you may say, well, you know, Chicago, it has a homicide rate the same as the national one for Mexico. It has homicides that increased in 2020, and it has 2.5 times the number of police to Toronto, and it has almost 5 times the incarceration rate. My point is that what London, England is doing and what Toronto is doing is to have much lower crime rates has almost nothing to do with criminal justice. So we need to focus on what those cities and countries are doing, and they want to do better. So let's help them do better. So my second issue is, what is this science? And the reality is that there are a whole range of important sources that are not being used. Crimesolutions.gov, the US Department of Justice website, the World Health Organization website. Now, were you to go and look on these websites, you would actually, unless you've got a PhD in crime prevention, and there aren't too many people who have that, you would not know what to do. So the book that I did on ending violent crime basically gives you the sorts of things that those sites tell you. This is data. This is not the rates of crime. This is looking at what has succeeded in influencing rates of crime. So some of the things that tackle risk factors are those things that outreach to youth. Doing life skills training for sports coaches, I can't be against it. But the evidence is very strong for programs that outreach to you. 50% reduction in crime, better than the status quo, better than the way that we're doing things at the moment. You can do even better if you begin to use epidemiology in hospitals. Epidemiology is in everybody's mind because of COVID, but actually we've known for a long time that epidemiology of victims presenting to emergency rooms can lead to very large reductions in violence, as was shown in Cardiff, or as is shown in the US in dealing with gun violence. We know that parenting and early childhood can give us large reductions. We know that school curricula. We know the programs like the Canadian program, Stop Now and Plan, these can all give us much better than the status quo. So we need to help people use those. Now, this is a bit more complicated to follow in a presentation like this today, but what it basically says is there are also things that can be done, like situational crime prevention, like diverting from police, like using police better. I think it's extraordinarily important to emphasize in Kyoto the reference to gender-based. And I would like us to be putting an equal emphasis on gender-based violence and its reduction to gun violence. Gun violence, but particularly in the US and the Americas, gets, in my view, a lot of attention, rightly, but it means that the reduction of violence against women doesn't get. Well, we know a lot about how to reduce that too, 50% or better from bystander intervention. And I can go on. SASA there with a 54% reduction invented in Africa, now being used in Honduras. So there's a lot of stuff on the global south. So there's an easy way to help cities and countries check whether they're using those. And this is a safety monitor tool that looks at key evidence-based programs that tackle causes and ways to use police smartly. You can have a look at it from my website. I will not go into, but what the important about it is it's not just measuring trends in crime, it's measuring whether you're actually doing the things that will significantly reduce violence based on data and science. So my third part is, what are the essentials? And hey, other congresses identified various things that need to be done in the 1996 urban guidelines or the 2002 crime prevention guidelines. And essentially there's 7 things. And you can look at these at another time, but the ones I want to highlight here are the importance of having a leadership office to make the changes, of using diagnosis, that's epidemiology, and of training the people to make these things happen. Now, if you actually do the things that make this happen, you get positive results. That's basically what Glasgow did, and now is being spread across the United Kingdom, and in my view, should be being spread across Latin America. But the Glasgow strategy was inspired by Bogota. So you don't need to go to Glasgow to find how to do it in Latin America. And that little chart on the right shows the impressive results that you get from doing it right. Another complicated chart, but basically it shows that if you follow those 7 essentials, you can get results. Coahuila in Mexico. People say Mexico does not know how to reduce violence. Well, they have one city that demonstrates you can do it. It focuses primarily on alcohol, but it's proof that it can be done. So I mentioned Glasgow, 50% reduction being spread across the United Kingdom. It needs to be spread everywhere. I'm not in a rush to spread it in Europe. Their problems are basically not the same as we're experiencing in the Americas or in Africa. I will mention that the province I'm speaking to you from actually has law forcing municipalities to develop a community safety and well-being plan. I think the legislation is interesting. Of course, we have to see how it's implemented. But we have examples from high violence countries, Bogota, Coahuila, I've mentioned. We have the famous example in Boston, but we have to be wary about getting too excited about what's hyped in the United States. Those cities that have supposedly followed the Boston model had increases of 30 to 50% in gun violence last year, New York City included. So safety monitor tool that lists those 7 essentials, that talks about checking whether you're getting a prevention dividend from broad social policy, and talks about what ILANUD, what Douglas talked about in monitoring outcome data. But we have to set targets. What we measure, we treasure. So we have to set targets. And that's a basic part of all the SDGs, almost not discussed in Kyoto. So how do we accelerate buy-in? First of all, there is an incredibly compelling case that Johannes has mentioned, in my view, very softly. I'm not going to mention it so softly. If you actually invest in proven solutions to prevention, you will increase GDP in high violence countries like the Americas. Yes, more important to me than increasing GDP is saving lives and protecting women, but ultimately increasing GDP will, it creates jobs, it creates communities that people want to live in, and it is part of the very important cycle. And I think it's important to know that the cost of prevention, from broad social change is huge, but from using the interventions that give us reductions like 50% within 3 to 5 years, that is affordable. It's also what the public wants, and it's a smart way of using limited dollars. This is just a picture to point out to you that many victims want prevention. They don't want it to happen again. That's what these movements, Black Lives Matter, the No to Violence, Marching for Our Lives, that they are wanting prevention. So my conclusions: intergovernmental organizations, we have to get them to back violence prevention for development, to use those safety monitor tools and training, to foster exchanges that are already going on tiny budgets so that more of them happen. We need to help governments establish that leadership office and promote the long-term causes, tackling causes, but particularly to invest in tackling risk factors and raising awareness. People, the public and decision makers and practitioners need to be aware that prevention works. It's incredibly cost effective, and it will save lives and protect women and children. And as a lead into Juma, cities are key to a lot of this. And they are already, groups like Peace in Our Cities, the parliamentary mayors, are already committing to 50% reduction by 2030. And they are exchanging information about success stories, about proven prevention, about the guidelines, about causes and risk factors, but they can't do it on their own. We need to help them with adequate and sustained financial aid. So my conclusion is we've got to do things differently to get different results. We need to act now to transform our world. As the Secretary General and all those world leaders said in 2015, it's not too late. We need to act now to do things differently. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Irvin, for your presentation. Unfortunately, the slides of your presentation were not visible or did not change. So I suggest that you put them on your website, urbanwater.org, your presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, so that everybody who wants to follow it up can look at it there. And also, I know that all the presentations of our panel will be included in the Congress documentation, but I don't know when that will be available. So if you just upload your PowerPoint presentation that you just gave, people will be able to look at it there. I have to cut it short because we're a little bit behind schedule, and I want Juma to have the full time for his presentation. Introducing Juma is difficult because he's so active all over the world. He is an urbanist and a social scientist, and he graduated from the Sustainable Urban Development program at the Oxford University. and he currently coordinates the Global Safer Cities program at the UN Habitat. And Irvin was one of the fathers, I understand, of that program. He has more than 20 years of experience in program development and implementation and crime prevention programs in cities, and did that in almost all the continents, in Africa, Latin America, in Asia and the Pacific, and in Eastern Europe. And he was also instrumental in building the global network on safer cities, which also has partners in North America and Western Europe. A key outcome of 25 years of work of the Safer Cities program has been the shift in thinking as to how to deliver safety in cities away from a police and criminal justice system only approach to one that sees the co-production of safety for local governments and the coordinators and citizens as the key actors. We have the old saying that police alone cannot do crime prevention, but you cannot do crime prevention without the police either. A key achievement of this new thinking for governments to invest in has been the adoption of the UN system-wide guidelines on safer cities and human settlements in May 2019, so about 2 years ago. Juma, I'm looking forward to your presentation, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Am I loud and clear?
Yes.
Very well. Thank you very much. I will not really belabor what the previous presenters have stated, but just to underscore the outcomes of the 14th UN Crime Congress in Kyoto, what Johannes elaborately presented, coming up to what Irvin Waller then presents on what is the proven practice that cities themselves are now asked to build upon. So over the past 25 years, UN Habitat Safer Cities program has been piloting and implementing the city crime prevention strategies around the world. And this has successfully enabled states to adopt UN system-wide guidelines on safer cities and human settlements to guide that implementation work. As Irvin stated, what we need now is to act differently and to find ways of how to scale up the crime prevention initiatives, policies, and programs with the ideals of financing, better legislation, and better planning. Now, UN Habitat brings to the fore the urban development practitioners and linking this to the crime prevention arena. In this sense, we have now shifted the conversation from just crime prevention to one that speaks to the broader urban safety field. Multi-level governance of safety is a key dimension where we say that the role of the city is, as the lowest level of government closest to the people, is now understood to be the ideal coordinator for promoting crime prevention as a no one-size-fits-all solution, but at the same time to ensure that we have impacting policies and programs on prevention that can be measured and monitored. In this particular undertaking, UNODC and UN Habitat have come together with a joint programming framework, which was elaborated upon at the Kyoto Crime Congress. And in this particular joint programming framework, the SDG 11 and SDG 16 are seen as key driving goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and linked to what we have as the new urban agenda. UNODC and Habitat have piloted initiatives around evidence-based urban safety programming in South Africa, Mexico, and Colombia, which are useful grounds to see to it that we can act differently and consolidate the experiences, the long-term experiences on prevention policies in these three countries, to integrate prevention policies into broader urban strategies and interventions. The security challenges, of course, of individual cities, as we all know, are increasing as a result of the intersectionality between local vulnerabilities and illicit flows that flow from across the national borders. And these are undercutting what we understand clearly as the good governance of countries and the rule of law, threatening security, development, and people's quality of life. We also now understand from a safety governance perspective that cities across the globe are being undermined by chronic insecurity and violence, which are often connected to crime challenges originating beyond the municipal borders. This is why we now not only speak to crime prevention as a field of justice and criminal justice actors, and not just also of the local government, but one that requires a whole of government approach, a multi-level governance of safety approach. The role of local governments, as Irvin has mentioned, is now clearly demonstrated as an arena with many proven practices. We have a critical mass of proven practices on prevention, on the co-production of safety and security for all, that we can now use to systematize the experiences, to build better quality and consistency of policies and programs on prevention at the local level. And this, towards the 2030 agenda goal, is a key aspect in which countries require to focus on in building what we call crime prevention as an issue of better urban management and better urban governance. Germany has been one of the countries that have been key at pushing the perspective of the implementation of the UN system-wide guidelines with a narrative of urban safety. Now, we cannot measure urban safety without measuring crime, and neither can we measure urban safety by only measuring crime. To better understand what to measure, we must understand the capacity and appetite of cities to measure and to create what I call credible and integral knowledge or data. We must also be able to now agree on definitions. We need to understand how vulnerability is different from victimization and why that difference is extremely important. There's also need for us now, as we think of acting differently, to re-examine the way cities and citizens perceive vulnerable groups, that the homeless, the undocumented people, or those who are addicted to drugs or are excluded, those who are jobless or the unskilled, are marginalized and stigmatized in differentiated ways that often make them vulnerable. We also must understand that in some countries, civic unrest may be an indicator that can offer us real insights into the disconnect between service delivery and poor communities, while in others, organized crime or transnational crime can be really the arena that measurement around the efficacy of multi-level governance of safety can actually be achieved, which leads us to interrogate essentially how we measure the competency of cities to be good partners, not only to those who bring funds and development, but to all tiers of government, to international networks, and perhaps most importantly, to the neighborhoods and what I call the community-based organizations. We need to understand clearly the mandate of cities. Very often, cities are not responsible for law enforcement beyond bylaws, yet their performance is measured by rising and falling crime rates. This has led to an ever-broadening spectrum of crime prevention categories, sometimes expanding them to the point where it seems that everything is either crime, law enforcement, or crime prevention. Yet it is true that many functions of the city contribute to urban safety, that planning, legislation, financing are essential to safe and inclusive cities in which people can live their best lives with little fear and few restrictions to their mobility and access, with housing tenure and schools that are centers of the community. Not everything that shifts crime rates and vulnerability is about crime. That is an important aspect that was mentioned in the Kyoto Crime Congress. Now, there is also a third category that moves us from looking at not just the risk factors, but to look at the social capital of cities. Things that are often motivated by the way we interact in cities, the way we celebrate culture, the way we develop coping and adaptation abilities to high crime and violence. There are many emerging practices, particularly in the arenas of arts and culture in high-gang areas, where cities are able to build on the resiliency of communities to promote better qualities of life. And here is what UN Habitat wants to put greater emphasis and effort in encouraging cities to invest more in this particular direction of proven practices. Of course, in addition to this, we need better documented evidence of what cities have been able to showcase in this particular area, and to be able to then come up with a clear monitoring framework that goes beyond just the traditional indicators we have been using to measure crime and violence. UN Habitat, in conclusion, is now developing what we call the Urban Safety Monitor, which will enable us to build this comprehensive set of indicators across sectors and to provide for local governments a platform to work with other levels of government in promoting what we call annual state of safety of the city report, and linking this, of course, to the voluntary local reviews that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is talking about. I would like to conclude my presentation by really putting the focus and emphasis on the role of cities and how the criminal justice actors, as well as the urban development practitioners, require to come together with a particular manifest of measurement and monitoring. And we need to start now talking about the impact of crime prevention policies in cities and in countries. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Juma, for your presentation. And I have two messages for you in the audience. Irvin just uploaded the link to his presentation into the chat, which will be also recorded in the Congress documentation. So either you can download it now or find it on the Congress documentation there. I thank all of the presenters, of course, for their contribution and for their effort. And I think what we heard means to me that we have a lot of knowledge, we have a lot of asserted goodwill to put it to work, but there's still a lot of room to actually do it, to actually do what we want to do, what we know how to do, and then to measure the effects, the outcomes in terms of saved lives, saved suffering for victims, but also in terms of better economics, better life for everybody. And I was very impressed by the coherence of these statements, that what we know not, and that we need to compare, to make our statistics comparable so that we know about each other and to see how we stand and where we stand and how we can progress. So thank you very much for these insights. And also thank you very much to the audience. You have been patiently listening, also supporting and tolerating the technical difficulties that we had with microphones and building work in our place here, and presentations not uploading. Thank you very much for being with us, and I hope that next year I will see most of you in at the next Congress. And I give the floor to Job. You had
no, I was just trying to, Burkhard, I saw that Anke was writing in the chat. And
I didn't see that.
A question was coming, so I just wanted to warn you that maybe there's a question before you close this session.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I can't. I didn't see the. I'll try and see the question. I hope it will be in the chat. Yeah, there it is. Okay. Anke just said that she thanks you all for the international view on crime prevention, and thank you very much, Anke, for your feedback. That's very kind, and I know that a couple of colleagues have been in the audience too, Frank Buchheit and Claudia, of course, here from the Congress office. Yeah, I'm happy that we opened the Congress with this panel. Do any of you have any closing remarks? Okay, then Juma?
No, I think we just thank the German Crime Prevention Congress for facilitating this ILANUD International Forum that has allowed us to develop structured dialogue around this particular issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think Claudia has heard that, and I will forward it, of course, too. And for me, it was a great pleasure and an honor to chair this panel. And I thank you all for your cooperation, especially those who had to rise very, very early to do so. Thank you, and bye-bye at the next Congress.